this morning's conversation, this afternoon's conversation, we are going to be engaging a conversation on violence. Pretty broad word. There's a lot of conversation to be had around it. There's a lot of conversation to be had around it that is larger than where we are now and also very relevant to where we are now at the same time, right? So when we decided to do this conversation this Monday, we weren't expecting to be so close to the conversation per se, yes? Mm-hmm. And yet here we are, right? So let's get started, I suppose. We wanna, let's engage this conversation. Let's do it, because I definitely want to hear what everybody has to say. And also for folks live on Facebook, Masa, can you be on Facebook duty, please?
Yes, I'm gonna do my best to monitor all of that.
Yeah. So folks on Facebook Live, if y'all have questions, please post them in the comments. We will be happy to answer to the best of our abilities any possible questions that we can answer, any questions that we can possibly answer. So please feel free to ask as we move through this conversation, keeping in mind that the topic is not only a sensitive topic, but like we said previously, a broad topic. And so we don't necessarily have all the answers and the solutions because of the complexity of the topic, right? As an organization, are we looking to offer some sort of insight into this very serious and difficult subject? For certain we are. But we also want to be clear that we do not have all of the solutions for certain, as we do not have all the solutions for everything in this world, but we are always willing to do the work. So any of those pieces of conversation that you want to bring into play as well, we more than welcome in terms of, asking or suggesting things that are viable to our organization or the world at large. Okay? All right, so how we planned this conversation was that each of us would bring a few questions to the table so that we could have, yes, an organic, but also slightly structured conversation so we don't derail. We are three people who love to talk, and it can definitely go in all kinds of directions. So which one of us would like to start with a question?
Ooh.
Well, one thing that I would say, I'd love to, Masa. Thank you. Thank you so much for that invitation. So,
voluntold.
So I want to first start by restating, particularly because I think for me this first question, as I've reflected on what my answer to this question would be, my question or my answer has evolved even more in the last week, for instance. And also I think even if my definition has been constant for some time, certain incidents in our society oftentimes lead us to focus on different dynamics of a definition because of the things that are going on. And so first, I also want to say that I'm really grateful to our team here at Community Tampa Bay, who has decided to have this hard conversation at a hard time, that we had already had this slated for a conversation, and yet the timeliness of this provides us an opportunity to show how we have a hard conversation within our office and perhaps help people who are looking for some additional context in some kind of way. I know it's going to be helpful for me to even begin to engage in this conversation with the two of you, who I miss so terribly much because we're not in the office together having these hard conversations in person. So with that, I would say, thinking about the word violence, and when we are looking at the things that are happening around us right now, but also our historical context and the education perspectives that we're bringing into this conversation. What does the word violence mean? Like what perhaps images come into our minds, or how would we define violence if we were asked? Because I'm asking.
Sam, me or you first? So I think I'll actually kind of reference back to one of the creating space conversations that Sam had with a advocate and activist who is working with domestic violence. And I think like that was something that I think is like, I really like what y'all were talking about and like bringing up in terms of the micro versus the macro. And I think like, I remember like some folks in the chat like Seth were pointing out like that connection is like so relevant of like violence in domestic violence doesn't have to be physical, right? Like it can be a whole spectrum of things. It can be, it's control, it's intimidation, it's threats, it's you know, it's all of these different things that it doesn't have to be physical in order for it to be violent. And then there is physical violence as a part of that. And then like thinking from like systems, then it's like, I definitely think of violence more like based off of that conversation of like thinking in terms of intimidation and threats, like even if there isn't like this physical one-on-one violence or this physical manifestation, like there is a violence that happens all the time that we kind of just accept as like this is normal. Like it's normal to have these forms of intimidation and threats and things like that if it comes from certain sources that we deem as official or as kind of sanctioned. But then also in terms of like interpersonal relationships, how am I being violent in my speech or in my actions in a way that creates a lack of safety, you know, creates a sense of intimidation, you know, even if I'm not aware of it, like what am I doing to contribute to that, to somebody else's trauma and experience, you know? So I think like it's definitely making me think a little bit more broadly and differently about violence, and expanding that definition. So that's where I'm at.
I hear what you're saying.
Sam?
I think for me, violence is everything that is disrespectful, non-consensual, and boundary breaking. So all the way from a systemic level to an interpersonal, and systems also, right? Like we think, so sometimes we think systemic level and we think those people there, right? So we think like White House, we think administration, half the people who we don't even know, you know who they are, what their positions are. And we think about like, when we think about government, we definitely think of, we certainly sometimes can think of them as being untouchable or unreachable. You know, we think about systems, I feel, on very, as a very vague, intangible thing. That's what I'm looking for, as a very intangible thing, when really systems are all around us, right? In every single institution that we occupy, there is a hierarchy, and that is a system. And that is a system that is then further defined by the systems that hold them accountable or are responsible for them, you know? And so I think we miss the mark sometimes when we don't see those things as very tangible spaces that can be held accountable, right? And I think the violence that comes from there, the way that I break it down into those three aspects of, is what is happening to certain communities disrespectful? Check. Is it with their consent? No. Check. Is it crossing their boundaries because you don't even know what their boundaries are? Check. You know, so any and all of those. And then when you come all the way down to interpersonal relationships between either, you know, us as residents of a community and police officers, us as residents of a community with other residents of a community, in our very own real life partnerships, right? Like either intimate partners or with our friends and so on and so forth. Anything that is disrespectful, unconsensual, and boundary crossing are all forms of violence, regardless of whether they are physical, emotional, or psychological. And even more perpetuated when they are physical plus emotional plus psychological, all of which are valid spaces within which people want to feel safe. You know? Any questions so far?
I feel like go ahead.
From our Facebook?
I was just gonna say, wow, like my mind is going to the word power as well, to add into this broad definition that we're beginning to flesh out collectively as we're thinking about violence. the way, how my mind goes, I'm always, first thing when I'm going to be asked a question, a foundational question, is to look up a definition. And so, of course, I've done such work, and thinking or seeing what the World Health Organization has to say about violence. It says the intentional use of physical force or power threatened or actual against oneself, another person, or against a group or community, which either results in or has high likelihood of resulting in injury, death, psychological harm, maldevelopment, or deprivation. And so some words that really stick out to me when I'm looking at that, I'm thinking about that power dynamic, and Sam, a lot of what you were talking about, it connects into that power dynamic, not just thinking about it from a personal one-on-one perspective, but all the way up to a systemic perspective, and then also all the systems around and in between. And then adding this level of, like, we're not just talking about physical injury, we're certainly not just talking about death, we're talking about psychological harm, maldevelopment, and deprivation. So when we're particularly thinking about these systemic, the systemic violence, that we recognize that there can be these other harms that are not at all tangible, in the way that if we just think about violence from a physical perspective, it takes us far, far broader than that.
Heard. Absolutely.
As we're having this conversation, so I was struggling with, like, making sure I don't want to ask a question that oversteps boundaries, right? Even in this conversation. So I just want to make sure, like, if I ask something that you feel like don't feel comfortable answering, like, again, like, as per our community agreements from before, like, definitely, like, redirect, tell me, hey, I can't do that right now. But I think, like, based off of what you're saying about kind of this hierarchy, right, of kind of institutional power and violence, like, there's different relationships that we have with that. And so I kind of wanted to ask if we feel comfortable to sort of explore, like, what is each of our relationships with violence, in terms of, like, because I think violence can affect people more directly, more indirectly, and be in different positions within that hierarchy, or within the sides. Like, are you receiving violence or perpetrating? So I kind of wanted just to ask, like, what is your relationship with violence? And how much has violence had a direct impact on your life? Since for me, I know that it hasn't, right? And so I want to recognize that is something that is a privilege that I have, that I haven't had that as a direct impact on my life. And I think that has impacted my perspectives over time. So I wanted to kind of put that out to
when you say
all, if you feel
hasn't at all?
Not that it hasn't at all. I mean, in terms of, sorry, let me clarify that. In terms of direct violence, so I think there's different levels of this, so I can explore that further. From a direct violence inflicted upon me directly, I think the level of impact is relatively low. In terms of physical violence, very low. And in terms of, so in all of those sort of direct ways, direct violence has not impacted me personally as much. And at the same time, I've been reflecting a lot on recently, kind of even just navigating things like locking doors and things like that, like taking personal precautions against potential threats from other people. I've noticed, like, a difference in perspective between myself and others who might have a little bit more privilege when it comes to being safe from violence. And some of those things are things I've inherited. So, like, my mom has been mugged and held up at gunpoint. So that was not against me directly, but the violence that she has experienced, and in terms of her identity as a woman, that violence inflicted upon her, that is something that it impacted how she lived her life. And like, I inherited some of those things in terms of practices, in terms of like, how do I be aware of taking precautions in some cases? But those are things that other people who I know haven't had those kinds of experiences, or know people who've had those experiences, don't necessarily think about. So that's kind of, that's sort of one level that I know for me, I'm exploring, like, what is my relationship with violence. So I'm still in the process of exploring that, but I wanted to see what y'all had, as if you've done some exploration of your relationship with violence, then what does that look like? And
So first, Masa, I want to say thank you for reminding us as participants of this conversation that we have done work both in the context of hard conversations, but also within the context of our office and the conversations that we have on a day in and day out basis because of the work that we do around community agreements, and recognizing that we all personally have our own boundaries and also our own triggers. And that we're bringing those into this conversation. And so when you were asking the question and clarifying the question, I found myself moving from different spaces of thinking about violence and how it has impacted me. And some of those are bringing out really hard emotions. And so even as I'm thinking about it, the question, and thinking about how I want to respond, I'm also going through kind of a weighing perspective of would I share that context, or would I share that perspective or experience versus would I not, right? And so some things are too personal for me to share within the space. So I appreciate that we've established those boundaries to be able to craft our conversation in a way that's safe for me and comfortable for me, but also is informative for all of our learning. And so first, thank you for that, and thank you for creating that context. I wanted to talk a little bit more about that as well, for particularly people who have never been a part of one of our hard conversations before, or who are viewing our hard conversation and have not been a part of the creation of community agreement. So thinking about that question for me personally, and particularly kind of where I am, and recognizing perhaps my answer would look differently in a different space where I had maybe a better or a level of privacy versus also where I am mentally in this space right now with the things that are happening in our country. And I'm thinking most about a situation that just happened the other day that my husband and I were walking in our neighborhood, and there was a house that was for sale and vacant, and we had this moment where, you know, he was excited. He was like, oh, you know, let's go take a look in the windows, and I was like, let's not. And that was a piece of like me experiencing violence for identities that he holds, and also me feeling like I didn't feel safe as well. And so it was interesting because we both had this moment, and it was like one of those things where we're like, is this funny or is this not funny? And like, how are we feeling in this moment? We kind of just kept with our walk. We did not walk and look in the windows. But it just really had us both thinking about that situation. I know we talked about it later and around what that meant for us. So that you know, our definition of the threat of violence to ourselves can change over time with our experiences personally, and also with the things that are happening around us. I have been the victim of violence, physical violence, and I definitely, again, I feel like some of those experiences are things that I talk about very rarely with a very small group of people, but they are a part of my day-to-day decision making in terms of the way that I live my life and how I'm able to navigate myself into certain situations. So I have triggers around that violence, and I know that there's certain things that are just completely non-starters for me. And so violence is something that I have a part of my schema on a day-to-day basis, absolutely, at some level. Mostly something I'm not talking about on a day-to-day basis, but I am navigating my decision making through that context.
Word. Thanks for sharing, Tammy. Violence for me is probably one of the easiest, not easiest, wrong word. Also what I'm looking for, and like one of the most permanent aspects of my life, if that makes sense, right? Pervasive aspects of my life, constant. Let me just go with a simple word. I don't know why I'm looking for such complicated words. It's one of the most constant aspects of my life, from systemic, with being illegal in certain spaces because of my identity, to physical because of those identities and how I present my identity. And then because primarily identity-based, so primarily let me start with that. Primarily identity-based on a systemic level because of my identity and because of the legalization or illegalization of those identities, because of, on an interpersonal level, on a professional level, in many other spaces, again, because of my identity, having that violence enacted against me, not being, being told how you can present yourself, how you cannot present yourself, consequences being there because of how you do and do not present yourself, not even just physically, but even intellectually, right? Because of my identities, I bring a certain, wow, this is tough. I bring a certain quality to the table. I bring certain knowledge to the table. I bring certain lived experience to the table. Okay, I'm getting back on track, right? I bring certain things to the table that are not just qualifications, right? That are not just having a master's degree, that are not just skill sets that I have, because of which I face a lot of violence on an everyday basis. Y'all know this, right? Like with CTV2, in spaces that we occupy, there are certain things that humans in our communities unintentionally, right, which is not an excuse, but unintentionally will still say to the many aspects of my identity, sometimes without recognizing that I actually hold that identity, right? So there's just a lot of, like someone will make an Islamophobic comment, someone will make a homophobic comment, someone will make a transphobic comment, someone will make a sexist comment. I can't escape from any of those. And also they're all very direct trigger points for me, right? That too is interpersonal violence, And then in certain other professional spaces, bringing the knowledge that my identity allows me to the table has been oftentimes silenced, right? Or there's been an attempt to silence it, So on a very regular basis, I think violence is very much a part of my life, on an everyday basis, as simple as constantly looking over your shoulder when you're walking to the gas station or whatever it is, because of, masculine performing woman, brown, so on and so forth, having to be constantly conscious of that is also violence. Even if the violence is not actually present, the surveillance of, as a precursor of that violence, that it might happen, that too is violence. Putting somebody in that state of constantly being aware of their surroundings, because that lack of awareness could then end up in violence, is violence in its own nature. So I think those are my experiences with violence. I'm so sorry, I was very inarticulate in that response, and I really apologize. I just didn't realize how it was going to hit me when I began answering. It didn't even hit me when y'all were answering, but then when I began answering, it got serious. It got real.
Thank you for sharing. And what you're saying is really connecting for me. And I'm hearing something, and I really like to hear both of your responses to this kind of question, or really statement. Is violence, the purpose of violence is not always to harm, but it also can be to silence, which is also harmful.
Yeah, I mean, I think silencing is harm too, Mm-hmm. I hear what you're saying. Not to like directly harm, but to create a harming environment around that human being. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I talk about I talk about my family a lot when I talk about these things. And I feel like as a child, I never experienced physical violence. Like I was never hit. I was never beat. Like none of that happened, right? But at the same time, there was always a threat of violence. You know, I was always afraid that it's coming because that threat was always made. So I was always afraid that it's coming anytime now, you know? So I think even as an adult, I live my life like that. Anytime now. Yeah.
As you were talking about and things. I know that this is like you said, it's like it's not easy to talk about. It's pervasive, and so it's just there all the time. With especially in regards to identity. I wanted to ask you, Sam, directly about. I know that you were that in regards to violence against, in particular, Black folks, and there are a lot of protests that are happening, a lot of work that's being done, and I know that you were at some protests yesterday, and so I wanted to ask about your experience and your observations in regards to that experience and how it relates to violence.
Absolutely, as were you at all the protests that I was at as well. So definitely want to like point that out. At the same time, we have a lot of folks on Facebook Live right now watching us. I know that the flyer and that the description of this conversation says hard conversations on violence. Still, I want to give out a trigger warning, especially for our humans of color. We are discussing some things that are coming up for us that we didn't necessarily preface before this. We did have a conversation about, you know, what direction we wanted this conversation to go in, because again, only because violence is such a broad topic, not because we wanted to filter ourselves in any way, but simply because we didn't want to digress from what could be the most significant areas of this conversation. So I just want to offer a trigger warning. We don't necessarily know what's going to come up in this conversation. So please brace yourselves. If you need to leave the conversation, please leave. If you want to put us on mute for a little bit and then come back to the conversation, please do whatever you need to do to keep yourself safe in this moment. And just know that we as individuals and as Community Tampa Bay respect any and all of the measures that y'all take to keep yourself safe, and strongly encourage you to do so. So going back to the question, yesterday I was at the protest. What was my experience and observation? Was that the question?
We're starting with that. I feel like we're opening up the, 100%.
I think the protest yesterday, which one is the question? I think the protest yesterday, we started off with a protest that was organized by Black Lives Matter. I was a safety marshal at the protest. Masa was also a safety marshal at the protest. We were given very specific instructions about what the objectives of the protest were, about how we wanted to, how we were expected to conduct ourselves in that protest as humans who are not as non-Black humans, right? And we were given that instruction directly by Black leadership. We were given those instructions directly by Black leadership, right? And so we took that very seriously to heart. We were told that at the end of the day, what we want is for everybody to come home safely, right? What we told at the end of the day was that we want to give out a strong and powerful message, right? But we do not have the capacity to give back what the system can potentially put out. And so we want to ensure everybody's safety, and that is why we have safety marshals. As safety marshals, it's our responsibility to disengage any potential instigation that might happen from either side, and again, ensure that everybody is safe no matter what, right? That's the route that we took. I think we did put out a very powerful message. I think, can you hear me? Yeah, I think the protest was definitely very, very powerful. I think what happened on the back end of that protest that dictated the way the rest of the evening was going was that Tammy, have we lost Rasa? No, he's back. Okay, sorry, you froze for a second. I think what dictated the way the rest of the evening went was there was a split after the protest that ended up in a bunch of humans not listening to Black leadership and not following the objectives that Black leadership had set for this particular protest. When that happened, we also encountered the system, aka the police force, right, who came in riot gear, so on and so forth, and engaged in not what is, in my opinion, productive, effective de-escalation tactics. There was a lot of intimidation. There was a lot of, like, tear gas is not fun, y'all. Like, it's not, it hurts you. So it's not fatal in the sense that it doesn't kill you, but it's still harmful, like it's damaging, right? Rubber bullets are damaging. And also, they're not aiming for certain people. They're just shooting out into the crowd. We had kids in the crowd yesterday. In this afternoon protest, we had kids in the crowd. We had encouraged people to bring everybody that they wanted to bring. A lot of our young humans are active in our communities. They want to also see the end of discrimination, So when something like that happens, that doesn't, for me personally, that doesn't, and I think I can also say organizationally, that is not a de-escalation tactic that we would ever use. Right? That's not what we are about. We would never use that kind of de-escalation tactic. So it was troubling to see that. It was incredibly hurtful to see that happen. And then, I'm literally running in the crowd and turning around and looking for these children, like, where are they? I don't have hands around them. My body is not protecting them. And it's physical. This is physical violence, right? So when that turned, it got really, really scary. And that kind of set the tone for the rest of the evening, where the National Guard was called. I think at some point state troopers were called into play. We went to that evening protest because that evening protest was being held by students. And when I say students, I mean students. There are very few humans who were over the age of maybe 24, 25, even 21, I would guess. Very young people there, coming there to do the right thing. But because of the way things went in the afternoon, things were further exacerbated for the protest that was happening in the evening. And I don't think police officers were anywhere close to understanding what was happening and then responding from that perspective. I think their response was very reactionary. I think it was very scary because you could see how angry they were. You could see how angry they were. I was right there. I was right in front of them. You could see how angry they were, and you could see how, whatever, there was just this, please understand my face. I'm looking for the word and I can't find it. There was just very much this kind of thing, ready to put people in their place, right? As opposed to, hey, let's talk this down. We know you're here. And they were all there for a peaceful protest. Right? That was their objective too. They were all there for a peaceful protest. If their objective was different, we can talk about that. We can talk about that too. Right? If their objective was different, but it wasn't. Right? And so that deviates from the conversation to talk about what if their objective was different. Their objective wasn't different. Their objective was, they kept shouting from the get, this is a peaceful protest. Don't, when they maced them, this is a peaceful protest. Don't attack us. It's a peaceful protest. It's a peaceful protest. They put their hands up. They got on the ground. They were on their knees. Everything that they needed to do to show that was a peaceful protest. And so it was very hurtful to see what that response looked like. It was very hurtful to see that the fact that these were young humans weren't even part of the conversation. Like, don't forget everything else. But even if you forget everything else, how do you deny the fact that these are children that you are not willing to do everything that you can to protect? At that point, it felt like discipline. It did not feel like safety. At that point, it was discipline. It was not safety, And I think that narrative really needs to change. That narrative really needs to change. That's where I'm coming from. Y'all still heard what, Masa, you were there. Tammy, I'm sure you've had a lot of conversation around this. You know, you've heard from people about this, so on and so forth. What are y'all's perspectives on this? Tammy, go.
Okay. My son and I are both like, so first I want to say thank you for sharing your experience, for being down and in really the thick of everything that was taking place yesterday. I also want to thank you for sharing the context from the organizer's perspective, that there are these safety officers that are part of the movement, and that there's conversation before the protest to direct people into sharing message and not engaging in violence, right? And so that there is that context, and that there's that foundation there for these protests that are meant to be nonviolent and really a platform for being able to share mission. And what I hear is that when the protest moves into the space that it did late into the evening yesterday, it frustrates the organizers because the message is then muddled. There's no longer the opportunity to get the message across in the same way that that they were able to earlier in the evening.
Right. I want to point out that when we do a protest, we have to be conscious of who we're doing it for, right? If we are serious about protecting Black lives, then it has to be led by Black people. The people who were instigators were not Black people, right? That informs us that they are not interested in following Black leadership. That is not solidarity. That is not allyship by any means. And we were in so what happened in Curtis Sixon Park, for example, that is not a Black neighborhood. Okay, where we were, that was a Black neighborhood. We're very particular about, we're very particular about hosting it in the Black neighborhood for Black humans, serving them, holding them safe, uplifting them, so on and so forth, with their permission. It happened completely with their consent, right? And then to not respect that and to come mess things up in that neighborhood, in a neighborhood that you do not live in, also means I am willing to come create a ruckus because it's not where I live. I don't have to clean this up. So then we leave our Black community to clean up our mess when we don't listen to how it is they want us to conduct ourselves. You know? We lose Tammy. Tammy,
you might have. She looks frozen for me too.
Okay. We'll keep going. She'll come back.
Okay. Yeah, I had to reset my connection.
She's gone. She'll come back
a little bit ago. Okay.
Okay. Maso.
Yeah. So. And Tammy can watch back after we're recording. So, but her question of about that point of sort of the experience there. I was actually, so like one of the things that I'm reflecting on a lot is, I was telling you earlier at the beginning, kind of like I was asking about like relationship with violence because of the fact that for me, like I haven't had a lot of direct experience personally, you know? It's not a pervasive part of my life. And so yesterday for me was definitely an opportunity to feel more viscerally that escalation, you know? So like, I think from the get, like even when we were just gathering, like at the first protest, we were gathering in the park, and literally it's just kind of like, all right, we're doing like hand signals for like, all right, so let's, you know, for slowing down and like, you know, emergency and like, you know, stop, and like doing kind of logistical things to make sure that people are safe and like doing those kinds of things. And then from the get, there's, you know, a whole bunch of police cars speeding past in like this residential neighborhood right next to a community center in a park with sirens blazing. And then there was, you know, somebody else who was not with the police department. Somebody else, I think, I heard that there was somebody who was openly carrying assault weapons.
Correct. I think we
and
all
again,
somebody with like a knife.
Yeah, there was just a lot of
there was weaponry. And I think when they told, what I heard was, well, this is a friend of mine, so she was following the person who had the knife to make sure that, you know, nothing happened, and to get like identification, so that, as in like visual identification, so we could inform other safety marshals of it too. And I think what happened was, when she passed by a cop, she told him he's carrying a knife, and the cop went, "That's legal." You know?
Yeah. So there's like a lot of sense of like, there's intimidation coming from a lot of different sides. And again, this is even if you're not using any of these things to inflict physical violence, there's like, everyone felt that tension. Like everyone felt like there is that stress and like that fear, right? Like that's literally, you know, it's like creating fear. And I remember later on at Curtis Hickson, like, hey, Tammy, we got Tammy back. I'm sharing a little bit of kind of what I experienced in relation to some of what happened yesterday, in the context of not having a lot of direct experience with violence, personally. And so that was something that for me, it was very scary. And it was kind of a shock to my system, because at the end of the day, I don't live with a lot of the threats on a day-to-day, everyday basis. And so then being in an environment where like I was feeling that constant sense of like, I don't know what's going to happen. And so it was a big learning experience for me, of like, it was like, this is what other folks, like this is just a small portion of what other folks deal with, in terms of exactly what you were saying earlier, of like, even just looking over your shoulder and being like, I don't know. Again, sirens blazing, and like kind of like, almost, I was mentioning to my roommate about like, it's almost like Pavlov's dog, like the ringing the bell and associating something. And it's like, the siren means be afraid. The siren means like stop, silence, which relates back to what Tammy was saying earlier about silencing.
Right.
And so, and then at the same time, at, you know, a couple of points, like, again, like, I think at one point somebody else was revving an engine. And again, regardless of whether they were driving through a crowd, like everyone got scared and everyone was running in all different directions to get out of the way, because that's a very real threat. Like we've seen this happening across the country, with people driving their cars into crowds of people, to actually inflict physical violence. And so that constant threat was something that that was new for me, personally. And so it was something that was a big learning experience for me. And I'm still in the process of reflecting and thinking about, you know, what is my role in checking myself and my own accountability, so that I can prioritize folks who are first in the line of that violence and that intimidation, those threats. So yeah, that was definitely a big thing yesterday for me.
Yeah, I definitely felt like I was compartmentalizing a lot, because a lot of times, so for the first protest that we were at, you know that, so after we got out of the park and we turned onto one of the main streets, Tammy, it was this really long street, right? And it was the park is right behind the police department, okay? And so there is like a line of cops on that street, on the inside of the police department. Right, so inside their gates there was a line of cops, and they were, you know, armed and stuff like that, right? And so to make sure that there was no instigators, so on and so forth, one of the other organizers and I was standing there, and then we had a couple of safety marshals further on, right? But we were like first point of contact. I'm feeling it now. You know, I definitely think that in that moment I was fully compartmentalized. Like I did not even, there was no thinking. Right? There was no thinking. There was no, okay, if something happens, you know, you're standing between the cop and whoever is going to do this, right? There was definitely, and that happened 2-3 times yesterday. And I really think there's no other way to do it for me other than to compartmentalize it or not do it at all. You know, it was a very strange space for me too. Like all the reflection that I'm having after the fact, like, what are you doing? Like, what did you do? You know, like that, I'm thinking to myself. But it's only now that I'm recognizing how lucky I was. And that's probably because, again, I'm not Black. You know, that's probably like a huge part of it because of how I present and, you know, like all the privileges that I come with too. The accent, so on and so forth, that, you know, makes people behave a certain way with me than they do with others.
What I'm hearing is both of your experiences as a person who is not Black in a protest, a Black Lives Matter protest. Both of you were able to explore the experience for yourself and recognize your own identities and the privileges that are associated with your own identities in that space, and that there is a level of safety that both of you are feeling because you were experiencing the same thing, right? Facing the same potential threats, and at the same time recognizing that your experience was different than Black protesters yesterday.
Yeah, I wouldn't say a level of safety for me. I wouldn't go that far, but I would definitely say a lot more privilege than Black humans. You know, for sure. We are at 12:49. I want to pivot the conversation a little bit. We are going to go on for a little longer because we do have our viewership is strong, and we've barely scratched the surface of this conversation. And I do think it's important that we continue to have this conversation. Okay, so I do wanna move this conversation forward a little bit and pivot to. We've shared our personal experiences. I do want to pivot a little bit to what we do well, is have these hard conversations with people who are in the system, right? It's what we do, right? We are able to have this conversation with institutional leaders. We are able to have this conversation with humans who are part of the system. And we have successfully, on many occasions, had very effective conversations in our professional standing doing what we do, right? And so I want to pivot a little bit to that conversation and ask the question of, we've been talking a lot about how we've experienced violence and what violence looks like to us, but there is a narrative on violence that I think y'all know where I'm going with this. There is a narrative on violence, right, that does not critique but criticizes violence under any circumstances and demands peaceful anything, especially protest, right? And then the conversation always goes from peacefully protesting, it's fine. Why do y'all have to engage in violence? Where does it get us? Gets us nowhere. Assuming, so let's say that it gets us nowhere, right? Let's just go with that, yeah? And then after that, there are all of these conversations around looting is not protest, looting is a crime, right? So these set definitions on how people are allowed to protest and not allowed to protest. There are set definitions on how people are allowed to express themselves and not allowed to express themselves, yeah? In the current context, when we are having these conversations with humans, Tammy, check me if I'm wrong for asking this question, okay? In the current context of having these conversations, how do we have these conversations with people? How do we engage that conversation from a point of what we do, right? Meeting people where they are and then helping them understand the things that, helping them understand that it's not surface level. There are historical root causes to where these things are coming from or not, right? Like, how do we have these conversations with the humans that we encounter? So I want to preface for all the people who are live on Facebook, we don't often we have these conversations constantly, and still we don't often get to fully evaluate and decide how we are going to be able to have these conversations in the different contexts that we occupy, because that's just not realistic. we can't have 200 different ways of having conversations in 200 different situations when we are also in 500 different situations, right? So it's not realistic. So sometimes we have these conversations without even having talked about it, because especially now, that is not a privilege that we are afforded because we are working from home. And sometimes we just get caught off guard having these conversations. So we reel in our Community Tampa Bay values. We reel in our when I say reel in, we rely on is actually what I mean. Our Community Tampa Bay values, we rely on our mission statement, we rely on our vision, and everything that we know and things that we do, and how we as Community Tampa Bay function on a regular basis, and we respond accordingly. Right? But we don't often have time to always prepare for every single conversation because that's just not realistic. So coming from that space, coming from that space, how do we meet people where they are when this is the conversation that's happening?
So I have a lot of thoughts and not enough time yet to be able to share all of my perspectives. And I probably could take this question in about 25 different directions. But the way that I'm going to take it right now in this case is first and foremost relating back to the quote that has been bounced around the Community Tampa Bay office a lot of times while I've been there, and certainly attributed into many, many, many different spaces as well, which is the nothing about them without them, right? So we talk about nothing about them without them, and I could totally go on to a tangent about the word them right now as well, and the us versus them context that I see play out a lot of times, unfortunately, in social media. Sorry, Sam, I didn't catch it.
Mm-hmm. Sorry, that was me conscientiously responding to somebody's comment on our live video. I'm so sorry. That was totally not.
Good. It's good. So when I'm thinking about that, though, the nothing without them, or nothing about them without them, I'm thinking about a lot of what you shared about your experiences this past weekend, being participants in a Black Lives Matter protest, and recognizing that role, right? I'm a participant, and I'm a participant that does not share Black identity, and so being able to defer, I think, is a huge, huge, important piece that sometimes I feel like is missing from our conversations. That there's a lot of folks who are commentating who have not yet done the work, and I want to invite everyone into the work. I want everyone to be a participant, right? In the way, I'm not saying that you have to go out and protest, but you have to be willing to do the work and recognize that from your identities, your perceptions and expectations are different than other identities, and that's a lot of the work that we do as Community Tampa Bay is explore identities, explore all different identities, and create space to talk about how different identities have historically experienced our history and continue to experience our country. And so how can we educate, and how can we continue to have dialogues that recognize our own identities and the privileges that we have associated with those identities before we're coming into the dialogue of before we're making judgment around that question of, is someone doing it the right way or not, right? The fact of the matter is, from a protest perspective, there's no right way in our history. A lot of people will point to the civil rights movement as a nonviolent structure or a nonviolent era, and the civil rights movement. The majority of groups that were in leadership during the civil rights movement were nonviolent, were committed to nonviolent protests, and yet at the same point there were certainly tons of call them riots, call them nonviolent protests, call them what you want. I think that it's important that we use the right words, and I don't want to bulk them all into one, because just as we're seeing yesterday, there's a variety of different types of conflict occurring, and those could be labeled in a variety of different ways, and particularly our own perspectives are going to lend them to definitions as well, right? That I think that we need to recognize that it's not on people who don't hold those identities to tell people who do hold those identities the right way to do it. And that if you want to be able to be a part of the conversation, then join the conversation and join the work. And then from that informed perspective, I think you'll be able to be a person in better solidarity than a person who's just commenting from the outside.
Do the work.
Do the work.
Legitimately join the conversation, do the work. Don't just jump in to give your 2 cents and then step out.
Right. And particularly where I think it's super easy to find something on social media that says something, and it's like, oh, I'm just going to post this and be like, I'm just going to leave this right here, or I'm just going to, like, what do you think about this? And not actually really connecting in, and not coming to the space of true understanding, or desire for understanding, but from a judgment perspective, from a I've got it already figured out perspective, rather than from a learning perspective.
Right. Awesome.
Yeah, I feel like that's again, thinking of our mission, right? At the end of the day, like there's a lot of different, for us with Community Tampa Bay, I feel like our methodology is not one methodology necessarily, but our mission is one that is helping us to, within the community, connect to the different methodologies and perspectives and experiences. Because, we're cultivating, inclusive leaders who, through dialogue and cross-cultural interactions. And at the end of the day, what is actual dialogue? What is, when we're having cross-cultural interactions and genuine dialogue, it's exactly what you're saying of engaging at the relational level as an entry point into evaluating our own perspectives and our behaviors. And I think a lot of times I definitely am very, I've come a long way in this, because I was very much, I used to take like a lot of philosophy classes, and I was like, yes, like this is the way to think. And like, I was very much invested in like particular ideas and particular theories and particular like kind of approaches that are kind of conceptually in this separate realm. And then at the end of the day, it's like, well, what is lived experience? Like, what are people's actual lived experiences? Like, how do I build relationships with folks to learn and examine how what resonates with me might resonate with me because it's based around my experience. And my experience is going to be different from somebody else's. And once I understand somebody else's experience, then something else might resonate with me more, because now their life is resonating with me and so now something new is resonating with me. So I think definitely like building a lot of real genuine relationships, and not just relationships that are feeling, kind of just like, all right, like I have a friend who is different from me. That's a great first step. And then we have to really listen and engage and value their lived experience and be in the process of understanding each other's boundaries. And I think that's another thing that I'm realizing is like over time, again, like all these things intersect. And I really love, Sam, what you were saying at the beginning of like sort of defining violence as, kind of like thinking in terms of, is this disrespectful? Does this cross boundaries? Does this violate consent? And I'm thinking like, wow, like how often do we have conversations with folks in our lives who we consider very close, where it's like genuinely making sure that we understand what is disrespectful to you, what are your boundaries. Like I know that those are conversations that I'm engaged with right now, and it's hard. It's something it's fairly new for me, you know. So I think like in that sense, that's something that if we explore those more of like those genuine relationships, I think that is definitely one step to better understanding each other's experiences as a foundation for then not just thinking of prejudice stereotypes from a kind of more surface level general perspective, but like really examining like what is my worldview and perspectives, and like how are these deeply embedded based upon prioritizing my own experience, and how do I sort of decenter myself in that process. I feel like that's to me that relates to what you're saying about doing the work.
CTB, just killing that values game on so many levels. So I think, is it okay if I offer my perspective on it? Yeah.
Please do.
Meeting people where they are. That's very important for me in the work that we do. And at the same time, it's a struggle, you know? How do you, as a gay human, converse with somebody to get them to understand that being gay is okay while they are invalidating your humanity, right? How do you do that? How do you meet them where they are, you know? But as program director of this organization, that's a hat that I have to put on and do that work because I am program director of this organization. And if I cannot do that work, then I cannot in good conscience ask other people to do that work as well, right? Now, certainly, can I pull in an ally and ask them to have that conversation for me? You know, can I say, Masa, how do you feel about having this conversation? Which I believe in certain contexts, where I've been slightly in the dark before, and I wasn't expecting a certain question, I have done previously, yes. But there's also a point of pride, right? For me personally, where if I'm teaching our young humans how to have these conversations, even when there are no allies present, then how can I potentially not have that conversation myself? So meeting people where they are. I think so often, comments. I think so often when people ask questions like that, there is not a deeper understanding as to why they themselves are saying what they're saying. You know, when people say, yeah, but looting is a crime, why would you engage in that? I often wonder, is that question actually coming from you and your analysis of the situation, or are you just jumping on somebody else's bandwagon? You know? So I ask a lot of, for me, in any situation, I ask a lot of why questions, right? So wanting to understand, where are you coming from in this context? Why do you think the way that you think? Right? Because if they say, well, looting is a crime, and I respond and I say, why are you prioritizing buildings over Black people's lives? Why are you expecting them to keep buildings safe when you won't keep their children safe? Right? That's the first answer that I want to give, but it's not going to reach them because I haven't done the work to get them there. You know, and as a queer person of color, it's certainly not my job to get them there, but in my position with the organization, it is my job to get them there. You know? So I find that when asking these questions and like pushing that envelope in certain ways, right? Even if we don't get to that point, it gets them to do some sort of analysis around their thinking process. Because a lot of humans who say what they say, it's coming from some sort of groupthink oftentimes. It's not, usually the isolated thought processes are the ones that have actually done the solid analysis and then come up with their own answer to why they feel how they feel about a certain thing. You know, I mean, that is the end result, is that why you're so worked up. Do you get as worked up when a Black human is killed as you are getting worked up when unoccupied properties are being destroyed? You know, like, that's the question that I want to ask, but I know it's going to be met with a lot of defense. That's not the point. That's not what I'm saying. That's what it's going to be met with, right? And then that conversation has been shut down before it even has begun. You know, so I think, like, getting people to engage, that's again, that's a systemic thing. We do not encourage people in our institutions, in our educational institutions, to engage in critical thinking. You know, you're always coming from a place of what's the right answer and what's the wrong answer to get the grade. That's what we are pushing upon our children. And so critical analysis is so often not part of how we engage young humans, not just in educational institutions. I know a lot of teachers really do try their best to do that work. I think at a systemic level, educational institutions do not prioritize that. But then as a society too, you know, we don't prioritize the thinking of young humans. And that is the most brilliant brain to start with. So I think, like, that piece also comes into play. That piece also needs to be covered. A lot of why our young humans, our students, are going out and protesting and doing the work and being able, yesterday, one of the things at the protest that I mentioned to y'all was all the white kids at the front were like, you know, white allies to the front, protect our Black and brown communities, white allies to the front, right? They were shouting that and asking white allies to come to the front, physically protect Black and brown humans. And I think that level of, my God, that level of bravery, that level of in the moment when they're faced with such fear, to be able to take that step and say that thing, I mean, they're doing the thinking, y'all, you know? And I think, like, that's where we need to come from. That critical analysis piece, that's where we need to come from. And again, I'm not saying that that's the only way to do it. I'm not saying that having that conversation, I'm not saying that having that conversation is the only way to do it. I'm saying there are multiple ways in which we should be doing this to both ensure safety and education. But what I do know is education and cultural change takes a lot more time. And it's not equatable with safety, right? And so I think more safety processes need to be put into place to protect our Black and brown communities while doing the education as well. But we can't purely focus on the education piece, because in the meantime, our folks are still dying. And so we need to be cognizant that simultaneous processes need to come into play. All right, we have 2 questions. One question, Masu, or Tammy, sorry, I'm so sorry. Did you have something to say?
I just really want to react to what you're saying, because I think it's really important to also add into the dynamic that we are not educated around having difficult conversations, that we are trained in our humanity, certainly as Americans, to not engage in difficult spaces, that we turn ourselves away from them. We literally physically kind of lock ourselves away from difficult conversations. And so being able to navigate these things is a skill set that is challenging for lots of people, because we've never been taught how to have the conversation, right? So one of the things as you were talking that I was thinking about is how often I've had conversations, particularly with some of my students that have gone through the civil rights course at Stetson. They're looking to be able to engage in the conversation, and they struggle to figure out the way to even start.
Right.
And so I really appreciate you sharing some of your skill set developed around leaning into these conversations. And I found myself in that same space this past week, when I have been engaging in some of these conversations as well. And what I've really tried to do is narrow down into maybe one aspect of the comment that is problematic, and to start from there, and then to broaden the conversation. from that perspective. So if I'm able, I'm not going to be able to answer the broader question. Certainly I can't answer it in one comment back after one comment too, right? It has to be a conversation. So I try to begin the conversation with one piece, and then we can kind of go out, and we might have to circle back, after we've built a foundation, but that we're actually able to build the conversation from that one foundational element.
Right. And it's important that those conversations stay consistent, and definitely it's so important that those conversations stay consistent. And oftentimes, unfortunately, we're not afforded those opportunities. So we do the best we can in that moment, and try as much as we can in that moment.
Right.
And then hopefully, you hand them a business card and hopefully they reach out. I'll let them know. Yeah. Are you all comfortable with moving to questions? Because we have a few questions that are coming our way, and I would like to answer as many of them. I'd like to answer all of them.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That sounds good.
Marcia, do you want to facilitate that first one that you've got in chat?
Okay. So the first one that we have here is from, I want to say it's Natasha. I'm hoping I'm pronouncing your name correctly.
Natasha.
Was it?
Natasha.
Natasha. Okay. So thank you, Natasha.
She's from a fan.
Okay.
my long ago fan. We used to work at a hotel together.
Oh, well, thank you, Natasha. But great question, because I think definitely we all have different identities here in this space, and definitely something that is super important. What are the ways that you can use your privilege to be a buffer between the system and people of color? So that is it's a lot.
I'm gonna give a story in response, and then I hope that you'll add to the context, because I think this story is a literal story, but I think that there's a lot more to answering this question fully. So this story is coming from actually one of my prior students, and someone who was at protest over the weekend, and actually kind of similarly in the way that Sam was describing in a couple of circumstances, recognizing his own identities. He's white. He's a military veteran. He's got some size to him, and within this crowd, he had more experience. Right? I like to use that word when we're talking about age. And he had more experience, particularly recognizing that a lot of the protesters were young humans, and being able, recognizing his own privileges. He literally stood as a buffer between police and protesters, and was able to use his own identity in a very physical way to be able to help navigate that, and be able to provide the platform for the protester to get their message across that perhaps would not have been there had he not been able to be using his privilege within that space. So I just really wanted to share that, because I think that that's just a literal thing that came to my mind. But when I'm thinking about my privileges and how I've been able to utilize them in the past for people as an advocate, and in solidarity of people who come from different identities, I think about being able to first and foremost recognize my own privilege, and to recognize that as a strength and contribution, but then also be able to, in the same space, check myself and say, that doesn't mean that I'm coming in this to speak for somebody or to take away from their experience, right? So it's this kind of balance and tension of recognizing my privilege and the opportunity that I may have, but also saying, is this in solidarity, and constantly checking that space, and making sure that it is in fact within solidarity.
Mm.
Awesome.
I think I'm trying to think of other, because not everyone has the ability to, of course, physically be a buffer And I think there's different, like, it's kind of thinking about like different forms of privilege. Like, what are the different ways? Like, in a sense, there's a lot of self-reflection involved in identifying what privileges do I have? Thinking about, and I think, Sam, we've had this conversation before where you've challenged me to kind of reflect on what are my boundaries? What am I willing, to do? Like, what are the privileges that I have? What power do I have? And kind of going through that process internally, and thinking about, okay, like, what skills do I have? Do I have financial resources, different things like that, and figuring out like what are the ways to, like, I think, one of the things right now is definitely there's a lot of folks who are coming together and donating in order to bail people out of jail, as a way of, making sure that there is not continued suffering after being, hurt, shot, tear gassed, and then making sure that there's resources for folks. And like, I think that might not be a buffer directly, right, in the same way, but there is using privilege as a way of reducing harm as much as possible. I think it's hard to think in terms of like completely buffering, but in terms of how do we reduce harm, how do we reduce pain for each other, that's something where I'm thinking right now. Sam?
Privilege. Everybody has some modicum of privilege, right? Certainly there is white privilege, for sure, right? That stands at the highest level of that privilege spectrum. I don't necessarily know that the question being asked is specifically being asked, what are ways that you can use your white privilege to be a buffer between the system and people of color? So I will address all levels of privilege, right? As a person of color, I have privilege over Black humans. I know that I'm not treated the same way by authorities. As an immigrant, I know that I don't have the kind of privilege that citizens have. Yesterday, for example, I had to strategically remove myself from the protest before curfew because I cannot afford to be arrested. It won't just be an arrest for me. There could be deportation that follows. And that is not something that is not a risk that any human of color should have to take, any non-immigrant should have to take, right? It's not a risk that I'm saying this straightforward. It's not a risk that I'm willing to take. This is my home and I want to live here. So that is not something I'm willing to put on the line. Life, body, mind, soul, you can take all of it. I'm willing to put all of that on the line, right? But in terms of privilege, in terms of how can you be a buffer between the system and people of color, there is certainly not a 12-step process by which that can happen, right? There are multiple ways in which that can happen. But most importantly, what I would say to humans who have privilege, so they can put themselves between the system and people of color, is do it responsibly. You have to be strategic about it. You cannot be haphazard about it, right? When you think, no, I have privilege, so I have to go do this, and do it without thinking of the impact behind it and only the intent behind it, there is a high possibility you might cause more harm than good. Secondly, simply because you have privilege does not mean you are automatically invited into a space to act as a buffer. Ask the people that you have privilege over, that you are trying to be a buffer for, do you need me, first and foremost? Can I come in? May I enter? What can I do for you, if anything at all? Do not ever assume that simply because you have privilege, you also have a role in that space, and people of color should automatically say, oh my God, look at this person with privilege coming to help us. Of course, come on in. Don't ever assume that you are welcome in a space that you do not share identity in, right? So be responsible, be strategic. Also, I just want to be clear, there is no such thing as a woke person. Woke is past tense. It does not imply you are never done with the work. Woke implies the usage of that word in itself is cultural appropriation. So if you would like to know more about that, please do some research, and it will show you can learn how it is cultural appropriation. But the idea of, if you just look at woke purely in its singular English meaning, because it is in past tense, it means your work is done. Your work is never done. That is a part of that responsibility. Keep on that responsibility. Take on that responsibility. it's a high level of responsibility, and everybody here has the potential and the opportunity to do it, especially where we live right now, right? The idea of being unintentional, fam, that's kind of old, fam. You know, like it's really old, you know, and it's getting older by the day. So let's quit that idea of being unintentional and let's move toward being intentional, because unintentional ignorance really means that, not that I haven't done the work and oh my God, I didn't know. It means I did not do the work on purpose and I did not want to know on purpose. And that in itself is a high level of privilege. Let's move away from that, you know? We definitely need to start doing that work to be responsible allies and stand in solidarity responsibly and figure out what it is, and let humans of color lead, let Black humans lead, let whatever minority community you are supporting. We need to learn how to, it's not much learning, we just need to let them lead. Follow their direction, we'll be all right, you know, but follow their direction. That is the responsible way to be allies, and anything outside of that is not allyship, it's not solidarity, it's you doing something for yourself. So I would strongly recommend that if you are doing something for the community, do it for the community. That's I just preaching, am I not? Yeah, that just happened. Soapbox just happened, yeah. Okay, so we move on to the next one.
There's that. And scene. And that was boss.
I mean, but what you're saying connects back into me where the earlier question and talking about doing the work, right? So it's reinforcing and coming from a different direction to this same super tactical takeaway, which is do the work, right? Let's do the work. This is going to be challenging. That this is going to be hard work. This conversation is a hard conversation, right? I mean, literally name hard conversations. And it is because it is hard, and we have to lean into that hard, right? Like, so I love what you were talking about with like the unintentional, right? Because it's like, no, we're all intentionally here. Like no one is free from this conversation. We all live in this society today here on June 1st, 2020. And therefore we all have a space in this conversation, and we all can show up and do that work.
So I think the next question that we have on here is Nicole's asking or saying, I struggle with the looting question. My mind doesn't accept that the person doing the looting is doing it necessarily for Black Lives Matter. So again, like intention, right? Like what is the purpose behind it? You're saying I'm thinking maybe wrong. The looting has a greater purpose, ? So in navigating sort of like what is happening with the looting question, and like intent, impact, I think there's a lot of different things that are wrapped up in this question. So any thoughts?
Either of you want to go? I just took up a lot of space, so.
So what I will say to begin with is I think when we're talking about movements generally, movements are organized by groups. You know, usually there is a group that is organizing a protest. Certainly the protests that have been taking place, the majority of the protests that have been taking place over the weekend have been organized by groups. And those organizers, as Sam had mentioned, particularly the one that she participated in yesterday, has safety officers, and their structure and their foundation developed around the protest. And also, you know, there is usually, and there certainly is with Black Lives Matter, a platform and a purpose and an objective of protest, right? So there is a platform, and that platform is something that protesters should be subscribed to, right? And also, we're all humans, and we're always bringing in our own perspectives, our own objectives, etc. And so when we have a mass group of people, some of those may be very directly aligned with the organizers of the protest, and others may not be aligned in the same way, or certainly have a continuum of different types of connection with that platform. So, I think one thing we should always be thinking about when we see protests is that we have people coming to protest for a variety of different reasons, and that those things could, those reasons could be not aligned with the organization that has planned the protest.
Heard. Awesome.
I'm trying to think, because I think again, thinking in terms of like kind of what I was sharing earlier about like relationships and like perspectives, right? I think at the end of the day, like I have to kind of go to for myself, I'm like, do I know anyone personally who has looted? And like I haven't had a genuine conversation. Like, so again, like everything that I could possibly say would be speculation. Everything that I can possibly go through my own mind is speculation. Like I can definitely kind of like come up with like ideas of like, how can this tie in? How can this relate? Like what might be, motivations, thinking, purpose, all those things. And at the end of the day, like I personally don't know, because I have not had that interaction and conversation with folks. I have had conversations and like interacted and heard perspectives from folks who definitely felt empowered by like some of the burnings of buildings, where it's like there is like something, there's a lot of power in that. There is some kind of like this sort of like, there is that sense of so from a very personal standpoint, like I used to be a huge fan of, I still kind of am, that movie V for Vendetta. And there's a lot of folks who love that movie, right? And again, there's like something, like it's a movie, and at the same time, it's like, well, there's something that resonates, even if it's a movie, right? It resonates. And kind of in the same way, there is this sense of like, there is something unjust, and there is some kind of, we need to, whether it's symbolically, whether it's in some real way, challenge that institution, that structure, that system, and we do need to deconstruct things in order to reconstruct something new. So that's kind of, for me personally, sort of like what I have in terms of my own feelings, but then also in terms of sort of what I've heard and heard from other folks. So from that standpoint, I guess I feel like this is a non-answer from me. I'm sorry. But in a sense, like for me, it's more of like, well, withholding that judgment because of the fact that I haven't heard from folks about, perspective and value and experience around a particular action, behavior, issue. And knowing that there is potentially, knowledge, experience, context that I do not know because of my own experiences that I do not share. And I need to have for myself, I know that I need to have the humility to recognize that if I don't understand something, in order to approach that with just more questions, just to and figure out like, okay, how do I engage this? So that's kind of where I'm at. I don't know. It's a bit of a non-answer, but yeah. Sam?
No, I think that speaks very well to what Nicole is asking, right? Because she's saying she struggles with, Nicole, I'm assuming that your pronouns are she, her, hers, my apologies. I will use neutral pronouns. They're assuming that, they're saying that they struggle with that looting question. And I think you are giving them good points of view in terms of like how to address that looting question, right? And when I don't know, like you said, when you don't know something, you usually ask more questions about it. You want to hear from somebody who's directly involved before forming any such assumption. And I think it's great that they asked that question, because they say that they're struggling with it. Like, this is a really honest way to enter a conversation on something that's so difficult, right? I struggle with that looting question. And then, like, they tell us why they struggle with it. And then they say, you're saying I'm thinking wrong. The looting has a greater purpose. question mark. They're asking a question around it, as opposed to saying, no, fam, that's just wrong. I don't agree with what you say. You know, so I think that's such a great way to approach a question. And Nicole, I'm going to try and answer this a little bit for you, right? Direct action is not unusual in activism. It is not unusual in people exercising their right to have rights and to be treated equally and equitably. If you look at our past, you will see that pretty much every movement that has fought for their rights, including Stonewall, engaged in destruction of property. The reason why this happens is because regardless of capitalism, because of capitalism, we live in a society that prioritizes things more than they prioritize lives, right? And so that's a direct statement to demonstrate that there is more value placed on buildings and things, right? Like whatever it is that people are looting, the products or whatever it is that people are looting, over the lives of people actually being killed. So the same manner in which we do not respond to the killing of somebody in a minority community, especially in the Black community, in the same manner that we respond to minority communities engaging in looting. There's a lack of, it's not equal, right? The rage that people have toward buildings being looted and set on fire and so on and so forth, that destruction of property where there is no life lost, there's no life lost, that destruction of empty property, the response that people have to it is much different than the response that people have to lives being lost, right? Outside of that, historically too, there is a very unequal response to looting and rioting as executed by different populations of humans and the reasons behind it. So the response is more problematic than the act itself, which is why the act continues to happen as a drawing to attention of this response, right? Rioting happens after football games are won or lost. Doesn't matter which one. You win them, you riot. You lose them, you riot. Okay? Rioting happens in history, overall in history, right? Throughout the history of America, you have seen looting and riots taking place even in order to create the United States of America, especially in order to create the United States of America. And it is a huge part of American history as enacted by the system, right? But when the people use it as an uprising, use it as a tactic for uprising, as a tactic for garnering attention toward attaining rights, that's when it becomes a problem. That inequality of response, right? Like white humans being able to do something and not having the same, not even white humans, let's say majority community humans, because there are different levels of majorities as well, predominantly intersecting with white folks. When they are able to engage in certain acts and are able to get away with it, essentially, or it's not labeled as violence or riot, and then for the most surface level reasons. And then when communities of color do the same thing, for reasons such as asking for their rights, demanding their rights, for reasons such as trying to get justice for humans who have been violated or murdered in any way, shape, or form, that's when it becomes an issue. That inequality, that needs to stop, right? And a huge reason why direct action happens is because that is how we respond to direct action, in an unequitable, unequal, and incompassionate manner, to why direct action is taking place. So a huge part of that is the response itself. You know, and then 50 years later, we commemorate these riots with great with so much honor. We talk about Stonewall riots now. It's literally called the Stonewall riots, fam. We call it the Stonewall riots now, and everybody's all about going to Stonewall in New York and like taking pictures outside of it and, celebrating 50 years of the Stonewall riots and so on and so forth. We glorify it, but when it actually happened, nobody did. They got the same criticism then that people are offering Black folks now. Right? But for some reason, 50 years down the line, something that happened then with a certain community of people that is happening with a certain community of people now gets a different response. So I wonder if it's just that it inconveniences people that it is happening in their own time. So that's my response. It's a fantastic question. I think Nicole's asking a really good question, but that is my response. It is not just the isolated act of looting as we see it on TV. It is the entire historical context that runs amok from it.
I feel like it's super, and you were just talking about the Stonewall riots, which goes into the next question that's on here from Amira. Given today is the first day of Pride Month, is there a way that we can recognize this month and the LGBTQ plus community while also keeping focus on the racial crisis? Or should we give space to both of these causes individually so as not to take the appropriate focus away from either of them? Thoughts on how to navigate this in the current climate? Super, super perfect tie into exactly what you were just saying. Like it was like almost like teeing it up the setup there. So yeah, how do we navigate giving appropriate focus and space to multiple issues? And I think in this particular context, this is talking about Pride Month and current protests.
Who wants to answer? Y'all looking at the queer in this conversation. Is that what's happening?
Possibly.
What up, queer fam? Happy Pride Month.
We are in solidarity with you and are recognizing our own identities and privileges in this space.
I appreciate both of y'all so much. Amira, fantastic question, fam. I think I can answer that question in one word, but I will go on to explain just a little bit more. Intersectionality. Remember that a lot of LGBTQ plus humans are also Black humans, and there's that intersection for both of them, right? So I think we can definitely, there is a way to celebrate one identity while defending another constantly, and so I think how do we do that is we never let an LGBTQ plus conversation go without talking about racial justice. Being queer does not stand by itself. Right? We are all of our intersectionalities at the same time. And both of these movements are very closely connected to each other, even though historically they may not have been, right? And so Black humans have done a lot of work, communities of color have done a lot of work to ensure that that intersectionality has come into play, to ensure that there has been attention brought to those intersectionalities. And so constantly keeping in mind, how do we talk about LGBTQ plus Pride Month while recognizing that for a lot of young humans, always at the forefront of my mind. For a lot of Black humans, this Pride Month especially is incredibly difficult, and acknowledging that too in those conversations, right? So I think there can be definitely be a crossover, as there should always be a crossover. There can definitely be a crossover, especially during this time. I hope that is enough of a response. Cool? Yes, okay. All right.
Fantastic.
I'm gonna read from one of our other viewers, yeah? So Jennifer Hope Stroud said, excellent point on meeting people where, I wanna read it because she talks about how she meets people where they are, and I think it's really, like what she says will be useful to people watching. to hear. Excellent point on meeting people where they are. One of the toughest things I ever did as an attorney and as a human was to represent a member of the KKK. This person did not want me because I was a female attorney. He came around when he realized it was me or nothing. Eventually, we found respect for one another as people. It was so difficult, but I realized maybe he never saw a woman as an attorney or a woman as an equal. How could I dispel his preconceived notions if I did not address him as human first? It was hard to have the conversation. I started the conversation by starting with the fact that we were both humans. I can't even imagine that conversation. I do not know what I would do if I had to have a conversation with the KKK as Sam Obaid or program director of Community Tampa Bay. I'd probably just reach out to the two of you and be like, hey, jump in on this conversation. I have no idea. But mad props to this human for being able to do that. And also, like, that's an excellent point. I mean, what a situation to be in, right? Very powerful, very powerful.
I love where that story ends and really begins for them and their journey, and that there is this recognition of commonality and sometimes we have to start at we're both human, right? I mean, that is the first place that we even can begin to have the conversation. And from there, we're able to, to expand into spaces where we disagree, right? But once we've created some kind of connection and commonality, we're able to have that conversation a little bit more authentically and a little bit easier, perhaps.
Absolutely. Masa, any takes?
More admiration and kind of in the same boat of like, it's really hard. Like, I think it is, like, no matter what, it's really hard to navigate conversations when we are coming from extremely different places, and meeting people where they're at. And I think that's kind of comes back to sort of like figuring out our own boundaries and our own identities and privileges and navigating all that and doing that work ahead of time so that we are prepared to be able to engage when we can,
right?
And know how we can support and step in. Right. So
wonderful. Well, fam, this is our first hard conversations that has gone on for 2 hours. Very well done. We've had an excellent group of humans engaged with us.
We only have 24 more hours of content.
But I do appreciate this conversation greatly. I think there is more from here that we need to definitely have this conversation on, because currently we are at 12 viewers, but at our highest we were at 24 viewers, right? Which is excellent. I love that so many humans are engaging in this conversation, because it shows it's definitely representative that people want to have these conversations, and especially now people want to be able to do the work, right? Especially now people are realizing how important they are in being a part of the work, and I certainly want to commend that. Nicole Caputo, thank you so much for everything that you're saying on this chat. I really appreciate you greatly, fam. I don't know how we all know each other. Perhaps we do, perhaps we don't. Tammy, is one of your
my best friend.
Oh my God, okay. Welcome to the CTB community. Welcome to our family. We'd love to have you on board multiple ways. Once we get back to non-physical distancing, there will be several events that I hope to see you at, and that is a personal invitation from me. I hope Tammy does follow up and invite you further. But yeah, I absolutely love this. Well, approach with more questions, less judgment, just so many note takings, and so much openness to actually being able to have these conversations, right? So many comments that our folks are making. I absolutely love this. Common human. Okay, I'm gonna read the statement, right? And I know what they're trying to say. I'm sure y'all will too. Common human nicely shouldn't matter if you come from different places. I think what they're saying is common human niceties shouldn't matter if you come from different places. So regardless if you come from different places. Well, this has been an awesome conversation. I love everybody that has engaged so much. This has been so powerful. So many great points have been made over the course of this journey that the three of us have been through. And I don't know, I'm really excited about this conversation. This conversation went, I feel very relieved that we had this conversation. I think that's, yeah.
And one thing I'll say is that we certainly had 24 participate live, but we also will be posting this on our YouTube channel so that we're able to allow other people to view it. So if you have enjoyed it, or if you feel like there's somebody in your life that would benefit from hearing it as well, certainly we hope that you'll use it as a tool. We've talked about this in all of our virtual programming, particularly being physically away from each other and not being able to be in the office to have these conversations as they kind of bubble up in our day-to-day work, that the ability to have these conversations and to engage in all of our virtual programming is really as much for us as it is for our entire Community Tampa Bay family. And so I certainly thank my colleagues and their vulnerability and accessibility within this topic today.
Likewise.
Thank you both. Thank you all.
All right, fam. So Masa has posted in our chat a short survey for y'all, if y'all are willing to give us some feedback. Just so y'all know, we are a small but mighty team doing this work. And the mightiness is almost unpalpable in so many ways, shapes, and forms, because we will continue to do this work no matter what happens. But the way that we do this work well is because we are able to hear from our audience and have them let us know how we are doing, because it's always important that while we do what we do well, we also are able to do it better constantly. And we are constantly looking to better ourselves, both as human beings and as an organization. So if you could please fill in that survey, it is no more than 4 minutes long. That is all the time that it will take, but we would love to hear from you to see, again, right, like what we can be doing better, what you loved about it, and what some of your takeaways were. Also, my name is Sam. I'm program director of the organization, for those humans who don't know. If you have other topics that you would like to have us conversate on, please reach out to me at sam@communitytampabay.org. That is my email address, sam@communitytampabay.org. Many of you probably have my cell phone number. I work with children, so I always say everybody and their mother has my cell phone number. It is 313-212-5788. That's 313-212-5788. You can text me and let me know if there are any other thoughts that you have, or if you would like for us to engage in any particular conversations. We are creating these virtual spaces as they come to our mind and as we are innovating. But if there's something different or more that you think we could be engaging in, or if you are part of organizations that wants to engage with our organizations to further these conversations, I welcome an invitation for us to be able to do that. So please reach out to me and let me know what you think, how you are, what's going on, what you would like to talk about. We're here for all those conversations. I am here for all of those conversations, right? And my colleagues will make themselves available as they see fit. Thank you all so much. Anything else, fam? Oh, is that a good close? Is that a fine closeout?
That's a great closer. That sounds fantastic.
Right. Okay. So don't forget, Hard Conversations every Monday and Wednesday. If this is the first time you're joining us, Hard Conversations every Monday and Wednesday at noon on Facebook Live. It was lovely chatting with you two. It was lovely chatting with everybody.
Thank you.
Watched our conversation. Look for it on YouTube.
Thank you.
Bye, y'all. Bye. Thank you.